On the 12th of September 1816, a baron's ward named Margaret Ashworth stood at the edge of her guardian's music room wearing a gown let out twice since her mother's death. The 40 guests filling that room had come to hear a soprano, but they left having witnessed her betrothal announced to a wool merchant she had never met. Baron Colton held her inheritance, her name, and every door she might walk through. Everyone assumed she would curtsy, thank her guardian, and accept the match by morning. What the Duke of Ashcombe said instead, from the back of that crowded room, would be repeated in London drawing rooms for the rest of the season. Margaret had learned, in 5 years under her guardian's roof, to keep her expression still no matter what was said over her head. She had practiced it first at her father's funeral, then at every dinner since where Baron Colton's debts were discussed, as though she were not present. Tonight the stillness cost her more than it ever had. Mr. Josiah Pratt, twice her age and thrice her guardian's fortune, bowed to her across the room with the satisfaction of a man closing a sale. Mrs. Hartley, the Baron's sister, had already begun accepting congratulations on Margaret's behalf, as though the bride herself were a formality to be settled later. Margaret did not look for sympathy in the crowd. She had learned that too. She looked instead toward the tall windows, where rain had begun to streak the glass, and thought only that she needed air. It was then that the Duke of Ashcombe crossed the room. Julian Verne was not a guest anyone had expected at a musical evening hosted by a baron of Colton's modest standing, and his presence alone had already drawn glances before he spoke a word. He was known in Parliament for silences that unsettled men twice his rank, and in ballrooms for leaving before the dancing began. He stopped before Baron Colton, inclined his head with perfect courtesy, and asked, in a voice pitched to carry no further than was necessary, whether the announcement had been made with the ward's knowledge or merely her presence. The Baron's smile did not falter, but his color did. Margaret, watching from the window, understood that something had shifted in the room, though she could not yet have said what. She did not know his name until Lady Frances, the Baron's wife, murmured it to her behind a fan a moment later. Ashcombe, the Duke of Ashcombe, her late father's godson, a man Margaret had believed existed only in the letters her father used to write and never send. She had no memory of ever meeting him. And yet he had crossed a crowded room on her behalf, a stranger to her in every way that mattered, and asked a question no one else in that house had thought to ask in 5 years. Margaret pressed her gloved hands together and waited, unsure whether to hope or to brace herself, while the rain went on falling against the tall windows and the musicians, uncertain what else to do, began to play again. On the 12th of September 1816, a young woman named Margaret Ashworth stood at the edge of Hertford House's music room in a gown the color of wet slate, mended twice at the hem, while 300 candles burned above heads that would not turn to look at her. Baron Colton held every advantage a guardian could hold over a ward with no living parent and no fortune he had not already spent. Her signature, her silence, her future, all of it his to spend as he pleased. Everyone in that room expected the evening to end, as every evening at Hertford House ended, with Margaret seated near the wall, unremarked, while Mrs. Hartley's laughter carried over the music. What Baron Colton did instead, rising before the assembled guests with his wineglass lifted and his voice pitched to reach the farthest corner, would leave Margaret standing in the center of a room full of strangers, engaged to a man she had never once been introduced to. He said her name first, as though he were announcing a horse at auction, and then he said Josiah Pratt's, and the room turned to look at her all at once. The way a room turns to look at anything it has decided is now permitted to stare at. Margaret felt the heat climb her throat before she understood the words. She had heard the name Pratt exactly twice before that evening, both times in passing, both times in reference to wool and warehouses and a fortune built on neither charm nor birth. She had never heard it in reference to herself. She looked for Lady Frances and found her instead looking at her own hands, folded too tightly in her lap, and Margaret understood in that single unguarded glance that Frances had known, or guessed, and had said nothing, because there had been nothing a woman in her position could say. Mrs. Hartley's smile, when Margaret finally located it across the room, was not cruel in the way a slap is cruel. It was cruel the way a closed door is cruel, final, and dressed in good manners. Josiah Pratt himself stood near the fireplace, twice Margaret's age, his coat cut well and his face arranged into an expression of mild, transactional satisfaction, as a man might look upon the signing of a favorable lease. He did not cross the room to her. He inclined his head, once, as though confirming a delivery had arrived intact, and returned to his conversation with a wool merchant from Leeds. No one had asked Margaret whether she wished to marry Josiah Pratt. No one, she understood as the room's attention finally began to drift back toward the musicians, had considered that her wishes were a category of information relevant to the transaction at all. The musicians had only just resumed, a thin thread of pianoforte struggling to fill the silence Colton's announcement had cut into the room, when the doors at the far end of the music room opened without ceremony, and a man Margaret did not recognize crossed the floor, as though the assembled guests were furniture he intended to walk directly through. He was tall in the particular way that made a crowded room seem suddenly to have too little air in it, dressed in unrelieved black but for the white of his cravat, and he did not stop until he stood near enough to Baron Colton that the Baron's wineglass trembled very slightly in his hand. Margaret had never seen him address a room, but she had heard his name spoken in drawing rooms the way certain names are spoken, carefully, and usually followed by a small silence. He asked Colton, in a voice pitched low enough that only those nearest could hear it clearly, whether Miss Ashworth had been consulted on the matter of her own betrothal before it was announced to 300 witnesses, or whether he ought to understand that her consent had simply been assumed, the way a guardian might assume the consent of a piece of furniture being sold with the house. Colton's face went through several colors in quick succession. He said too loudly that matters of a ward's establishment were properly the concern of her guardian and no one else in the room, and that he failed to see what business it was of the Duke of Ashcombe's. The Duke did not raise his voice to match. He said only that he had known Sir Thomas Ashworth, Margaret's father, and that he believed Sir Thomas would have wished his daughter's marriage to be a thing she entered with her eyes open, rather than a thing she discovered standing in a ballroom with 300 people watching her discover it. He did not say the engagement was forbidden. He did not say it could not stand. He said only that question, plain and unanswerable in front of witnesses, and let it hang over the Baron until Colton was forced to admit, stammering now, that Margaret had indeed not been informed beforehand, that the arrangement had been settled between himself and Mr. Pratt as a matter of practical necessity, and that he had intended to inform her that very evening, before the announcement, only the hour had gotten away from him. It was a poor excuse, and everyone in hearing distance knew it for one, and Margaret watched Colton's humiliation with something that was not quite triumph, because her own humiliation was not undone by his. The Duke turned to her then, for the first time, and inclined his head with a courtesy that felt entirely unlike Colton's careless nod toward Pratt across the room. He did not smile. He said nothing further to her at all. He turned and walked back through the doors he had entered by, leaving Margaret standing in a music room gone entirely silent, with no more understanding of why a stranger had crossed a crowded room to defend her than she had possessed a moment before he arrived. 3 days passed at Hertford House in a silence Margaret had learned, over 5 years under Colton's roof, to recognize as its own kind of verdict. No one spoke of the music room. No one spoke of the Duke. Mrs. Hartley conducted herself as though the engagement to Josiah Pratt had been settled calmly and by mutual understanding weeks earlier, and the household, taking its cue from her, conducted itself the same way, so that by the third morning, Margaret found herself doubting her own memory of the candles and the staring faces and the tremor in Colton's wineglass. She was seated in the small parlor at the rear of the house, where she took her breakfast alone more mornings than not, when Sims the footman brought in the post and set a single letter beside her plate before carrying the rest through to the Baron's study. The seal was one she did not recognize, dark wax pressed with a crest she had never had occasion to learn, and her name was written across the front in a hand so controlled it looked engraved rather than penned. She had barely broken the seal when Colton's study door opened down the hall and his voice reached her before he did, demanding to know what correspondence had arrived that morning and why it had been delivered to the parlor rather than to him directly, as was proper for any letter addressed to a ward under his roof. Margaret had read perhaps 4 lines by the time he reached her, an invitation, phrased with the same controlled formality as the direction on the envelope, requesting that Miss Ashworth call at Ashcombe House in Grosvenor Square at her earliest convenience, regarding a matter concerning her late father that the Duke of Ashcombe believed she was entitled to know. Colton read the letter over her shoulder without asking leave to, and Margaret watched his face change the way it had changed in the music room 3 nights before, though this time there was no crowd to witness it, only herself, and, hovering in the doorway with a look of careful blankness, Lady Frances. Colton said, with the particular sharpness of a man who has just been reminded that his authority has limits he did not choose, that Margaret would not be calling on any duke, that whatever business concerned her father's affairs properly ran through her guardian's hands and no other, and that he would compose a reply himself declining the invitation on her behalf before the morning was out. He took the letter from her fingers as he said it, folding it back along its original crease with more force than the paper required, and Margaret sat with her tea cooling in front of her and said nothing, because 5 years had taught her precisely how much good it did to argue with Edmund Colton when his mind was already made. It was Lady Frances who changed the outcome, and she did it so quietly that Margaret almost missed the moment it happened. Colton had retreated to his study to draft his refusal, the folded letter still in his coat pocket, when Frances followed Margaret up the stairs and caught her arm gently at the landing, glancing back once to be certain the study door remained shut. She said that her husband was a proud man before he was a sensible one, and that pride was about to cost him more than he understood. A duke's invitation, she said, was not the sort of thing a family in Colton's position could simply decline without comment, not when half the guests who had watched the engagement announced at Hertford House had also watched the Duke of Ashcombe cross that room to question it. If Colton refused the invitation outright, it would not go unnoticed, and it would not go unremarked upon, and the very people whose good opinion Colton needed to see Pratt's settlement through to a respectable wedding would begin asking why a guardian was so determined to keep his ward away from a duke with information about her own father. Better, Frances said, to accept, and to accept visibly, and to control the terms of the visit rather than hand the appearance of control to anyone else. Margaret did not know what passed between Colton and his wife over the following hour, only that by midday the letter of refusal had been quietly set aside and a new one drafted in its place, accepting the Duke of Ashcombe's invitation on Miss Ashworth's behalf, to be conveyed at his convenience within the week. Colton informed Margaret of the change himself, standing in the parlor doorway with the air of a man announcing a decision entirely his own, and added, before she could feel anything so foolish as relief, that she would not go alone. Mrs. Hartley, he said, would accompany her, as was only proper for an unmarried woman calling at a bachelor duke's residence, whatever the stated purpose of the visit. Margaret understood the arrangement for what it was before Mrs. Hartley herself appeared in the doorway a moment later to confirm it in person, her expression composed into something that might, from a distance, have passed for solicitous concern. Mrs. Hartley said, with the particular gentleness she reserved for remarks intended to wound, that she was certain whatever the Duke wished to discuss regarding dear Thomas Ashworth's affairs was a matter that ought to be heard by family, and that she would naturally wish to hear every word of it herself, so that there could be no confusion afterward about what had or had not been said. Margaret understood, standing in the parlor with the accepted letter already sealed and sent, that she was not being permitted to learn the truth about her father. She was being permitted to learn it under supervision, with a witness in the room whose only loyalty was to Baron Colton's version of events, and that whatever the Duke of Ashcombe intended to tell her, Mrs. Hartley intended to hear it first. Ashcombe House smelled of beeswax and cold stone, and Margaret was shown into a library where the shelves rose past 2 stories of ladders and brass rails, and where the Duke of Ashcombe stood already waiting, as though he had known the precise minute of their arrival. Julian Verne did not rise with any warmth in his face, only a formal inclination of the head first to Mrs. Hartley, then to Margaret, and gestured them both toward a pair of chairs set before his desk, with a spacing that made plain he had arranged the room himself, and arranged it to keep 3 people at a careful distance from one another. Mrs. Hartley took her seat with the brisk satisfaction of a woman settling in to referee a dispute already decided in her favor, her gloved hands folded, her eyes moving once around the room to catalogue its worth. Margaret sat with her back straight and her hands still in her lap, and waited, because waiting was the only posture guardianship had ever permitted her. Julian did not offer refreshment, did not make conversation about the weather or the drive from Hertford House, but opened a drawer, drew out a folded document bearing a red wax seal already broken, and set it on the desk between them without preamble. He said that Sir Thomas Ashworth, Margaret's father, had died owing his own father, the late Duke, a debt of honor, incurred some years before either man could have imagined it would matter to anyone living now. Mrs. Hartley's chin lifted at the word debt, scenting perhaps a demand for repayment that might yet be turned to her brother's advantage, and she opened her mouth to speak, but Julian continued before she could, his voice level and unhurried, the voice of a man who had rehearsed exactly how much he intended to say and would not be moved from it. The debt, he said, had been repaid in full, not in coin but in trust. His father had named himself, and upon his death Julian, executor of a marriage portion belonging to Sir Thomas's daughter, in the sum of £8,000, held separately from any inheritance Baron Colton had been informed of or permitted to administer. Margaret felt the room narrow to the sound of his voice and the sight of the document on the desk, her father's hand faintly visible in a signature at its foot, ink gone brown with 8 years. She had been told all her life that her father left nothing beyond debts and a modest annuity swallowed within a year of his death by expenses she had never been shown an account of. She had not been told there was money bearing her name that no one but this cold, careful stranger had ever controlled. Mrs. Hartley recovered her composure quickly, the way a woman recovers her footing on ice, with a small stumble instantly disguised as grace, and asked, in a voice pitched to sound merely curious, why such a sum had never been disclosed to Baron Colton, who was after all Margaret's legal guardian and the natural steward of her interests. Julian's gaze moved to her without any change in his expression, and he answered that the terms of the trust had been set by Sir Thomas himself, in writing, specifying that the portion should remain undisclosed to any guardian until such time as a marriage was proposed for his daughter, at which point the executor alone held the right to approve or withhold its release according to his judgment of the match's suitability. He did not say why Sir Thomas had distrusted the notion of a guardian knowing of the money in advance, and Margaret watched Mrs. Hartley absorb the implication and choose, visibly, not to pursue the question of what her brother might have done had he known £8,000 waited only on his approval of a husband. Instead, Mrs. Hartley asked, more sharply now, whether the Duke intended to release the sum toward Margaret's approaching marriage to Mr. Pratt, since the wedding was fixed and the settlement Mr. Pratt had already offered would only be strengthened by it. Julian said that he had not yet decided. The words fell into the room plainly, without apology or softening, and Mrs. Hartley's mouth thinned at an answer that gave her nothing to carry back to her brother beyond the bare fact of a fortune held just out of reach. Margaret, listening, understood for the first time that the visit had never been about informing her of a technicality. It had been about informing her that somewhere in London a man she barely knew held the power to decide, by law and by her own father's hand, whether her marriage to Josiah Pratt would ever be fully funded, and that he had not yet chosen to use it in Pratt's favor. She looked at Julian directly then, for the first time since entering the room, and asked, in a voice she kept as steady as she could manage, what circumstances he would require to be satisfied of a match's suitability. He met her look for a moment longer than courtesy required, before answering that he had not yet finished making that determination either, and the words carried a weight that told her the sentence was not truly about paperwork at all. It was decided, with a briskness that left Margaret little room to object even had she wished to, that she would travel to Ashcombe Hall in Kent to review the estate papers relevant to her father's trust, since the original documents lodged with the family solicitors were themselves copied from ledgers kept at the country seat. Mrs. Hartley could not object to the errand without admitting she wished to prevent Margaret from learning anything further, and so the arrangement went forward with Colton's grudging permission and a hired chaise that carried Margaret the 11 miles from the London road into a country of hedgerows going gold at the edges and low autumn light lying flat across stubbled fields. The hall itself rose from its parkland the color of old honey, long windows catching the last of the afternoon, and Margaret stepped down from the carriage into an evening quiet enough that she could hear rooks settling in the elms before anyone came to receive her. It was not Julian who met her at the door, but a stooped old man in a steward's coat gone shiny at the elbows, introduced to her by the housekeeper as Mr. Simmons, who had served the Ashcombe family, she was told, since before the present Duke was born. Simmons led her not to the estate office directly, but first through a gallery of family portraits, moving slowly, and Margaret understood after a few steps that he was not merely escorting her, but choosing his moment, the way old men do when they have carried something a long time and mean to set it down carefully. He stopped before a portrait of a gentleman in an older fashion of coat, dark-haired, sharp about the eyes in a way that reminded her uncomfortably of Julian, and said that this had been the late Duke, his Grace's father, a man he had served 40 years and buried with his own hands helping to carry the coffin. Margaret asked, because the silence seemed to want a question, whether he had known her father as well, and Simmons's face did something complicated, a softening around old grief, and he said that he had indeed known Sir Thomas Ashworth, and had been in the room, in fact, an under-steward then, sent to fetch papers and told to stay and witness, on the night the two men, her father and the old Duke, had sat until past 2 in the morning settling a debt that was never, to his certain knowledge, spoken of again by either family until now. Simmons took her at last into a small estate office lined with ledgers, lit a second lamp against the coming dark, and settled himself with the careful stiffness of a man whose joints had opinions about long-standing, and told her, without her needing to ask further, what he had understood of that night's business, even as a young man too junior to be trusted with its details in full. Sir Thomas, he said, had come to Ashcombe Hall in considerable distress, some misfortune of investment having stripped him nearly bare within a single season, and had spoken to the old Duke not as a petitioner but as a friend of long standing, the two having been at Cambridge together in their youth. Whatever passed between them, Simmons said, ended with the old Duke pledging to see Sir Thomas's daughter provided for, should anything happen to her father before she was settled, not as charity, for Sir Thomas would not have accepted charity even dying, but as the discharge of some earlier kindness Sir Thomas had once done the Duke's family, the particulars of which Simmons had never been told and did not presume to guess at. Margaret asked quietly why the money had been kept from her guardian, from Baron Colton, all these years, when surely a guardian ought by rights to know what funds existed for his ward's benefit, and Simmons's mouth tightened in a way that told her he had an opinion on that question he had learned, over long service, to keep private. He said only that the old Duke had been a careful judge of men, and that the trust's terms, undisclosed until a marriage was proposed, released only at the executor's judgment, had been drafted, to his certain understanding, expressly to prevent the sum from ever being treated as a settlement to be pursued, or a portion to be married toward, or worse, spent in advance by a guardian who might see £8,000 sitting idle and find reasons to consider it already his own to direct. He said the trust existed, in short, to keep her from being married for money, not to help any man marry her for it. Margaret sat with that a long moment, the lamp guttering faintly, understanding for the first time why her father, dying, might have trusted a stranger's family sooner than his own sister-in-law's household. And it was only as Simmons rose to see her to her room that he added, almost to himself, gathering his papers, that the old Duke had made his son promise something on his deathbed concerning the Ashworth debt, something Simmons himself had only half heard through a closed door, and would not, he said, his face closing like a hand, presume to repeat to her without his Grace's leave. Julian rode out before 9 to see a tenant dispute over a flooded pasture, and Margaret, left to her own company in a house that seemed to hold its breath around her, found herself walking corridors she had no true business in. The papers Simmons had promised to fetch were not yet ready. The morning stretched empty in the particular way that made her restless, and restlessness, in a house this size, became curiosity before she had quite decided to let it. She passed the long gallery of portraits, men in dark coats with the same set to the jaw, women painted stiff and correct beside them, and came, at the corridor's turning, to a door unlike the others. It was not locked in any way that announced itself, no chain, no visible bar, and yet something in its blankness stopped her before her hand had touched the latch. The wood was darker here, as though the passage received less light by design rather than accident, and the carpet runner that continued the length of every other hallway simply ended 3 feet short of the threshold, as if even the housemaids had learned to walk around it rather than upon it. She tried the handle once, lightly, more from habit than intention, and found it would not turn. A housemaid came upon her there a moment later, a girl no older than 16 carrying a stack of linens, and stopped so abruptly at the sight of Margaret standing before that particular door that the linens nearly slid from her arms. "Miss," she said, and there was real alarm in it, not the mild deference owed a guest, but something sharper. "That's her late Grace's wing, ma'am. Nobody goes in there, not since." The girl did not finish the sentence. Margaret asked, gently, "Since when?" And the girl's eyes went to the door and away from it again, as though the wood itself might report the conversation. "Since she died, miss. His Grace was 9. It's kept exactly as it was. Mrs. Fenwick dusts it herself, once a fortnight, and nobody else is let in. Not family, not guests, nobody." The girl seemed to catch herself then, aware she had said more than her place allowed, and gathered the linens closer, murmuring that she ought to get on, and was gone down the corridor with the quick, relieved step of someone escaping a room grown suddenly too warm. Margaret stood a moment longer before the door, listening to nothing, feeling the particular stillness of a space that had been arranged, deliberately, to receive no one. She thought of her own mother's things, disposed of within a month of the funeral because grief, Mrs. Hartley had said at the time, ought not be indulged past what was decent, and the contrast struck her with an unexpected force. not envy exactly, but a kind of ache at the evidence that grief could be permitted to last, in some households, as long as it needed to. She did not mention the wing to anyone that day, though the household's unease seemed to reach Julian before she could have found the words for it herself. He returned from the tenant dispute in the late afternoon, mud on his boots and a weariness about his shoulders that softened, briefly, into something like alarm when Mrs. Fenwick met him in the hall and spoke to him in a voice too low for Margaret to follow, though she caught her own name in it, and the word wing, spoken with unmistakable care. Julian's expression did not change in any way a stranger could have read, but Margaret, who had begun without quite meaning to study the particular economy of his face, saw something pass behind his eyes and settle. He found her in the small parlor an hour later, where she had retreated with a book she had not managed to read a page of, and he did not sit, only stood near the window with his hands clasped behind him in the manner she had come to recognize as his preparation for saying something he had not planned to say. "I understand you found my mother's wing," he said, and it was not an accusation, though she felt the weight of it as one regardless. "I did not mean to intrude," she said. "The door was simply there." He nodded slowly, as though her explanation confirmed something he had already assumed of her, and for a moment she thought he would let the matter close there, the way he let so many things close before they had properly opened. Instead, he said, with the particular stillness of a man choosing each word as though it cost him something to spend it, that his mother had died believing kindness was a debt, that whatever was given freely still had to be repaid in kind eventually, one way or another, and that she had spent the last years of her life trying to settle accounts that were never owed. Margaret waited, certain there was more, certain the sentence was only the outer wall of something larger he had built around it, but he only looked at her a moment longer, as though weighing whether she had understood enough, or too much, or exactly the wrong amount, and then said that the wing was not a subject he discussed, and that he trusted she would forgive an old household its old superstitions. She wanted to ask what accounts, owed to whom, and whether the debt of honor between their two fathers had anything to do with a woman who died believing gratitude curdled if left too long unpaid, but something in the set of his jaw told her the door now closing was not made of wood, and that pressing against it would gain her nothing but his retreat. She said only that she understood, though she did not fully, and he inclined his head and left her with the unread book and the distinct, unsettling sense that she had been shown the edge of something far larger than a locked corridor, and told, without being told, that she was not yet permitted to see the rest of it. Baron Colton arrived at Ashcombe Hall 3 days later without invitation and without warning, his carriage wheels churning the gravel drive at an hour so far short of a decent calling time that Simmons himself came to warn Julian before the man had properly descended the step. Margaret, watching from the upstairs window of the room she had been given, recognized her guardian's particular walk even at that distance, the slight forward lean, the hurried impatience of a man who believed his own urgency ought to compel the world to match its pace, and felt her stomach turn with a dread she had thought herself further from than she apparently was. She was not summoned to the meeting that followed and was glad of it, though the library where Julian received him was close enough to her room that fragments of the exchange reached her regardless, carried up through the old house's uncooperative acoustics. Colton's voice, when it rose easily. Julian's did not rise at all, which seemed, even through a closed door, to be its own kind of provocation. She caught the words settlement, and Pratt, and by God, Ashcombe, £3,000 is nothing to a man of your income, and then a long stretch of quieter speech she could not follow, Julian's replies too measured to carry. She gave up pretending to read, and stood instead near her own door, ashamed of the impulse and unable to master it, straining for what would decide, in ways she could not yet fully see, the entire shape of the winter ahead of her. What she understood, piecing the fragments together as best she could, was that Colton had come not to inquire after the trust's existence, which he now knew of, but to demand its immediate release toward the Pratt settlement, framing the request as a mere formality, a signature Julian could supply as easily as any solicitor's clerk, and framing his own need for it, though he did not say this outright, not where she could hear, as more urgent than a young woman's comfort in a match not yet 3 months arranged. She heard him say at one point, with a wounded, aggrieved dignity that made her hands close into fists at her sides, that he had raised the girl 5 years at his own expense, had clothed and fed and sheltered her, and that surely some return on that expense was owed him now, if not by law then by simple decency between gentlemen. Julian's answer, when it finally came clear enough for her to hear it whole, silenced her guardian more completely than any raised voice could have managed. He said that the trust was not, and had never been, an instrument for settling debts of any kind, his own family's or Colton's, and that its terms, drafted with a care he did not intend to abandon for the sake of another man's impatience, required him to judge whether a proposed match served Margaret's genuine welfare before he released a single pound toward it, a judgment he stated plainly he had not yet been given cause to make in Mr. Pratt's favor. Colton's voice cracked upward at that, incredulous, demanding what welfare could possibly be better served than a respectable marriage to a man of substance, and Julian's reply, quieter still, was that respectability and substance were not, in his experience, reliable proof of a man's character, and that he required rather more than a merchant's ledger before he would commit £8,000 to any bridegroom's account. There was a silence after that, long enough that Margaret feared the conversation had moved beyond the reach of the door, and then Colton's voice returned, low and ugly, in a register she recognized from a lifetime of small domestic cruelties absorbed rather than answered, saying that Julian forgot himself, that guardianship of the girl's person was Colton's own by law and long practice, whatever paper games her father's solicitors had arranged, and that the wedding would proceed at St. George's on the 14th of December exactly as announced, with the trust or entirely without it, and that Julian would do well to remember that a duke's disapproval, however loudly voiced in a country library, carried no weight whatsoever against a guardian's signed consent before a clergyman. She heard the library door open with more force than the hinges were built for, heard Colton's boots cross the hall floor in the same hurried, aggrieved rhythm with which he had arrived, and stood very still at her window as his carriage pulled away down the drive, without so much as a farewell sent up to the room where his ward was lodged. It was some time before Julian came to find her, and when he did, he said only that her guardian had made his intentions plain, that the ceremony would go forward as arranged whatever objection either of them raised beforehand, and that she should not mistake his own silence in the coming weeks for indifference, though he offered nothing further to explain what silence, exactly, he intended to keep, or toward what end he meant to spend it. Lady Frances came to Margaret's room at Hertford House 2 evenings later, after the household had gone quiet and Colton's study lamp had finally gone dark beneath the door. She carried a single folded paper against her sleeve as though it might burn through the fabric if she held it too long, and she closed the door behind her with a care that told Margaret more than any words could have before a single sentence was spoken. Margaret had learned, in the 7 years of her guardianship, to read the small tremors of this household, the particular hush that meant Colton's temper had turned inward rather than outward, the particular brightness in Lady Frances's voice that meant she was frightened and trying not to show it. This was neither of those. This was something closer to shame, worn openly, without the effort of concealment Margaret had come to expect from every adult in this house who claimed to act in her interest. Lady Frances unfolded the paper on the small writing desk beneath the window and set a candle beside it, and asked Margaret, without preamble, whether she recognized the hand. Margaret looked down at the letter and felt the room narrow to the width of the page. It was addressed to the solicitors Greaves and Combe on Chancery Lane, dated the 11th of June, some 3 months before the musical evening at which her betrothal had been announced to 300 strangers, and it stated, in a hand that curved its capital letters in the particular manner Margaret had been taught by her governess as a girl, that she, Margaret Ashworth, gave her full and willing consent to any marriage settlement her guardian Baron Colton should see fit to arrange on her behalf, present or future, and waived any objection to its terms. The signature beneath was her own name, formed in the loops and crossings she had practiced 1,000 times over a writing slate as a child. She had never seen this letter. She had never held a pen to compose it, never sat at any desk with any solicitor's address before her, never in her life waived an objection she had not yet been permitted to raise. And yet there it was, dated months before Josiah Pratt's name had ever crossed her guardian's lips in her hearing, proof already prepared and dispatched before the injury it authorized had even been announced to the person it claimed to bind. Lady Frances said quietly that she had found it among Colton's papers while searching for a household ledger he had misplaced, that she had known the moment she saw the date what it must mean, and that she had copied it out that same afternoon before returning the original exactly as she had found it, so that her husband would never know it had left his desk. Margaret asked to hold it, and Lady Frances hesitated only a moment before passing it across, as though relinquishing the copy made her complicit in something she could not yet name aloud. Margaret held the page to the candle and studied the signature until the letters blurred and reformed themselves in her vision, searching for some flaw, some crossing of a T or looping of a G that would prove a stranger's hand had shaped it rather than her own remembered one. She found instead a strange, cold precision, a signature that resembled hers closely enough to deceive any clerk who had never watched her write, and not closely enough to deceive her own eye now that she was looking for the seams. The G's tail curled a fraction too far to the left. The capital M, which she had always formed with a single unbroken stroke since her governess corrected her at 9 years old, had been built here from two separate motions joined at the peak, the join visible only under close candlelight, only to someone who had written that letter 10,000 times and knew its architecture from the inside. She said this aloud, slowly, and Lady Frances's face changed as she said it, not with surprise but with the particular grief of someone hearing a suspicion confirmed that she had hoped, against her own better judgment, might prove unfounded. Margaret asked when Colton could have obtained a sample of her hand close enough to copy, and Lady Frances said, after a silence, that Margaret had written a great many letters over the years at Colton's own direction, thank you notes to his creditors' wives, condolences to families of men he owed money, small domestic correspondences he had asked her to draft in his stead because his own hand was poor and hers was neat, and that any one of a dozen such letters, kept rather than posted, would have given a patient forger every stroke he required. Margaret sat with that a long moment, feeling something colder than anger settle into the place where anger should have been, a recognition that every small service she had rendered this house out of a ward's obedience had been quietly catalogued and turned, eventually, into a weapon against her. She asked Lady Frances directly whether her husband had commissioned the forgery himself or paid another hand to shape it, and Lady Frances said she did not know, only that the letter existed, that it was dated before the engagement had ever been spoken of to Margaret's face, and that whatever Julian Verne had been withholding these past weeks, whatever silence he had asked her not to mistake for indifference, this was very possibly the thing he had been waiting to prove. Julian's carriage collected Margaret from Hertford House at 9 the following morning, arranged through a note so plainly worded, a request that she accompany him to Chancery Lane on a matter touching her father's estate, that Colton could find no honorable ground to refuse it, though the look he gave her in the hall suggested he understood, even then, that something in the architecture of his plans had begun to shift beneath him. She carried Lady Frances's copy of the forged letter, folded inside her glove, against her palm, the whole journey through London's grey September streets, as though the paper itself might dissolve if she loosened her grip on it. Julian said little as the carriage moved, though she noticed he watched her more closely than he had at Ashcombe Hall, his attention returning again and again to her hands, to the glove that concealed what she carried, and she understood without being told that Lady Frances had sent word ahead, that he already knew what she carried before she had said a single word of it. The offices of Greaves and Combe occupied the second floor of a narrow building whose windows had gone amber with decades of coal smoke, and the elder Mr. Greaves received them himself, a small, precise man with ink permanently darkening the side of his right hand, who greeted the Duke of Ashcombe with the particular deference reserved for clients whose business had never once given cause for difficulty. Julian laid the copied letter on the desk between them without preamble and asked Greaves to compare it against any document in his files bearing Margaret Ashworth's genuine signature. Greaves's expression did not change as he read it, though something in the set of his shoulders sharpened, and he rose without a word and disappeared into an adjoining room lined floor to ceiling with document boxes, returning some minutes later with a slim folder tied in faded ribbon, the seal of Sir Thomas Ashworth's estate still pressed into the wax at its corner. Inside lay a receipt Margaret had signed at 16, acknowledging the transfer of her mother's few remaining jewels into the estate's keeping after her father's death, her hand still rounder then, less practiced, but unmistakably, structurally her own, the capital M built in the single unbroken stroke her governess had taught her, no seam, no hesitation at the peak. Greaves laid the two signatures side by side beneath a magnifying glass mounted on a small brass stand at the corner of his desk, and confirmed, in the flat, careful language of a man who understood that his words might one day be repeated before witnesses more hostile than these, that the letter dated the 11th of June bore a signature inconsistent with every other sample of Margaret Ashworth's hand in the estate's files, that the inconsistency was not the ordinary drift of a hand maturing over years, but a structural difference in the formation of specific letters, and that in his professional opinion, the June letter had not been written by the same person who had signed the receipt 8 years prior. He said this without drama, the way he might have confirmed the weight of a parcel or the date on a deed, and Margaret found the very plainness of it more devastating than any accusation shouted aloud could have been. Julian asked what should be done with the forged letter now that its nature was established, and Greaves, glancing between the two of them, suggested it might quietly be set aside, the June letter withdrawn from any bearing on the marriage settlement, the matter resolved between guardian and ward, without further complication, or the airing of an ugly business that could only damage the family's name in the telling. Julian's answer came without hesitation, and without heat, which Margaret would remember afterward as more unsettling than anger would have been. He said the letter would not be destroyed and would not be quietly withdrawn, that Greaves was to hold it, along with the receipt and any sworn statement he was willing to provide as to the difference between them, as evidence to be produced when the moment required it, rather than a private embarrassment to be smoothed over between gentlemen. Margaret, once they had returned to the carriage and the narrow street had given way to the wider thoroughfare toward Grosvenor Square, asked him plainly why he would choose the harder path, why a man of his rank, whose own name would inevitably be drawn into whatever scandal followed, would risk public exposure rather than settle the matter privately, quietly, as Greaves himself had all but recommended. Julian was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all, his eyes on the passing street rather than on her, and when he spoke it was in a voice pitched low enough that she had to lean toward him to hear it over the wheels. He said that privacy was the very instrument men like Colton relied upon, that a forged signature quietly withdrawn taught its author nothing beyond the value of greater caution next time, and that he had watched privacy protect a great many men in his life whose protection had cost other people everything they possessed. He did not say which men or which people, and something in the set of his jaw as the words left him told her the omission was not carelessness, but the closing of a door he had opened only partway, one she understood, without being able to say how, led somewhere near his mother's locked wing, and the promise his father had drawn from him beside a deathbed neither of them had ever fully described to her. The 14th of December arrived gray and still, the kind of flat winter light that flattened every color in Hanover Square to the same pale stone. Margaret stood in the vestry anteroom of St. George's in a gown Mrs. Hartley had chosen for her, ivory silk that fit as though it had been made for someone slightly smaller, and let a maid pin the last curl into place without offering a single word of help or resistance. She had rehearsed, over the preceding week, every possible objection she might raise at the altar itself, and had discarded each one in turn as either useless against Colton's authority or certain to be smoothed over by Mrs. Hartley before the clergyman finished his sentence. Josiah Pratt waited already at the front of the church when she was brought down the aisle on Colton's arm, his face composed into the particular blankness of a man conducting a transaction he considered already settled, and Margaret understood, walking toward him past rows of guests she recognized from Hertford House and from the musical evening in September, that she had stopped expecting Julian to come at all. He had sent no word in the 3 days since the visit to Chancery Lane. Lady Frances had pressed her hand at the church door and said only that some men needed silence the way others needed speech, which Margaret had taken, at the time, for comfort, and which now, standing before the altar rail with Colton's hand withdrawing from her arm, felt instead like a warning she had failed to heed. The clergyman began the service in the unhurried cadence common to weddings of convenience, his eyes moving between the prayer book and the couple with the practiced neutrality of a man who had performed the ceremony 100 times without troubling himself over what lay beneath it. Margaret watched Pratt's hands, folded before him, and thought of nothing in particular, not fear, not hope, only the strange, suspended calm of a woman watching her own life proceed from a slight distance, as though she had already left the room and only her body remained to answer when spoken to. The guests behind her rustled and settled. Somewhere near the back a child coughed and was hushed. She heard her own name spoken aloud for the first time in the service, Margaret Louisa Ashworth, and felt it land against her chest, the way a name spoken by strangers always did now, familiar and foreign at once, hers and not quite hers, the way everything about her life had felt since the night in September, when Colton had announced her future to 300 people before telling her himself. The clergyman reached the moment in the service reserved for objection, the formula so rarely invoked in a church full of guests that most had already stopped listening, and asked, in the same unhurried voice he had used throughout, whether any person present knew just cause why this man and this woman should not be joined in matrimony. Margaret heard, in the silence that followed, a single set of footsteps beginning somewhere near the rear doors, deliberate and unhurried in a way that made the sound carry the length of the nave before a single head had turned to find its source. She recognized the tread before she recognized the voice, the particular evenness of it, the refusal to hurry even now, and turned with the rest of the congregation to see Julian Verne, Duke of Ashcombe, walking up the center aisle with a leather portfolio held against his side, as though he carried nothing more urgent than estate papers to a meeting already scheduled. He stopped some 10 feet short of the altar rail, close enough that Margaret could see the exhaustion beneath his composure, the look of a man who had spent the preceding 3 days assembling something he had hoped never to need, and addressed the clergyman directly rather than the assembled guests, his voice pitched to carry without rising. He stated that he knew just such cause, that Margaret Ashworth's consent to this marriage had been obtained through a forged letter presented to her father's solicitors, Greaves and Combe of Chancery Lane, months before her guardian had troubled to inform her of the engagement at all, and that as sole executor of her father's marriage trust he was withholding, formally and for the record, the portion of £8,000 that Baron Colton had promised Josiah Pratt as settlement. He opened the portfolio and drew out the letter itself, holding it not toward Colton but toward the clergyman, who took it with the stunned reluctance of a man handed evidence in a courtroom he had not known he was presiding over. Margaret felt the church's attention swing toward her guardian with a force she could almost feel against her own skin, 300 faces turning in the same slow arc that had once turned toward her at Hertford House, and understood in that instant, with a clarity that arrived almost gently, that Julian had waited not out of indifference, but because a private letter withdrawn quietly would have taught Colton nothing, while this, the church, the witnesses, the clergyman's own hands holding the proof, could not be smoothed over by anyone. By March, the story of the forged letter had traveled through London drawing rooms with the particular thoroughness reserved for scandal touching a title, and Baron Colton, who had spent 30 years cultivating the good opinion of men who now declined to receive him, found that opinion withdrawn with a speed he had never thought to prepare for. He left London before the season properly began, retreating to a smaller property in Derbyshire that Margaret had never seen and had no wish to see, taking Mrs. Hartley with him and leaving Lady Frances, at her own quiet request, to remain behind under the protection of a cousin rather than follow a husband whose ruin she had done nothing to cause and nothing to prevent either. Greaves and Combe, acting on instructions Julian had set in motion the week after St. George's, restored the £8,000 to a trust held in Margaret's own name, answerable to no guardian, with terms that named her solicitors rather than any relation as the parties she must consult before any portion could be released. She was 24 and had never in her adult life controlled a shilling that was legally her own, and the solicitor's letter confirming the arrangement sat on the writing desk in her room at Ashcombe Hall for the better part of a week before she could bring herself to answer it, not from any confusion over its meaning, but from the strangeness of holding, at last, something that could not be taken from her by a signature not her own. Julian had offered her Ashcombe Hall as a residence while she determined what she wished her future to hold, framing the invitation with a carefulness that Margaret recognized by then as characteristic of him, not the coldness society still attributed to him, but a reluctance to presume, a refusal to arrange her life the way Colton had arranged it, even toward an end she might have welcomed. She had accepted, in February, on terms of her own choosing, a household of her own within his, a companion of her own selection, and the right to leave whenever she wished it. No one in the house had pressed her further than that, and in the 6 weeks since, she had begun, slowly, to notice the particular quality of a household where no one required anything of her at all. On a morning in April, with the windows of the music room thrown open for the first time since winter, and the smell of cut grass drifting in from the terrace, Margaret sat before the pianoforte that had stood untouched in that room since her arrival, and lifted the lid without quite deciding to. She had not performed for anyone in 3 years, not since Colton had judged public playing unbecoming in a ward he intended to marry off quietly, and her fingers found the keys with a hesitance that surprised her, as though the instrument itself required reintroduction. She began with something simple, a piece she had learned as a girl and had never entirely forgotten despite the years of silence, and let the sound fill the room the way she had once let it fill her father's house before his death had rearranged the whole shape of her life without asking her opinion of the change. She did not hear Julian arrive. She became aware of him only when the piece ended and the room's stillness resolved itself into the particular stillness of a man standing in a doorway who had been there for some time and had chosen not to announce himself. He did not apologize for listening, and she found she did not wish him to. Instead, he crossed partway into the room and told her, in the plain, unhurried voice she had come to recognize as his only voice, that his mother's wing had been locked since her death, not from grief alone, but because his father had blamed her, in his private accounting, for extending kindness to men who had never intended to repay it, and had raised Julian afterward to weigh every kindness against the cost of its betrayal before he offered it. A lesson Julian had followed for 20 years, until a letter forged in another man's hand had asked him to weigh Margaret's welfare against his own caution, and he had found, to his own quiet surprise, that he no longer wished to make that calculation. He said it plainly, without ornament, the way he said everything that mattered to him, and did not move closer than the doorway even as he said it, leaving the choice of what came next entirely in her hands, in the room where sunlight now fell across the pianoforte's dark wood, in place of the candlelight that had lit every room of her life until now. Margaret let her bare hand rest on the closed lid, the silk gloves she no longer needed to wear left somewhere upstairs, and said nothing in return, because nothing needed saying yet, and because she understood, watching him wait without pressing her, that he intended to go on waiting for as long as she required.